Hi! Welcome to this part of my review featuring the Nightfall core book. Nightfall is a dark fantasy setting for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you haven't seen my other Nightfall reviews, please check out the playlist in the description below. This time we are going to take a look at the history of the world of Yurman. In this setting there are three sources of major arcane power. Since the beginning, mortals' greatest interrogative was the origin of all. Eventually, the source of life was traced to the presence of three separate worlds. These three worlds presided over three different sources of arcane power, inherent to the worlds themselves. We have the sempiternal, or the Sidir, also known as Outer World or the Sidereal Plane. This is a dwelling for supernal beings, a boundless space filled with stars and celestial bodies, jagged with lights and nothingness. In this infinite layer of reality, every entity pays close attention to the vicissitudes of life created on the material plane. We also have the earthly world of Yurman. Mortals also call it Yurmanvi, which means of the living, or material plane. This is the known world, where all living beings and mortal species dwell. The energy that rules over this world, as it rules over all life, comes from the primes, which are ancient and omnipresent beings of sidereal origin. Then we have the Dark Mirror, also known as Enferun. This spectral reality harbors nothing but darkness and death, and it is intertwined in a dualism with the material plane. Its name, Enferun, means underworld or abyss in the prime tongue. Anything considered negative, disruptive, obscure, or concealed from light belongs in this dimension. Here reside the mirrored images of the primes, known as the Death Echoes. These dark entities enslave the souls of the wicked, who are drawn to them in death, and defile any life form that falls into their influence. No one knows what fate awaits those who die in Yurman. Most believe in and pray for becoming part of the world and of the prime's conscience, while others long for the cosmos. One belief, however, is shared by everyone. Those who die in unholiness, dishonor, or with a curse upon them are destined to spend eternity in Enferun. Then we have information on the Four Truths and the Old Tradition. The Four Truths are the cornerstone of the old tradition, for their disclosure ended any dispute about the beginning of the world and the energies that rule over reality. They were transcribed by Archmeister Lagoran, although there is no doubt now that some unknown entity led him in the transcription and named him the Oracle of the Death of the World. We have the first truth. In the beginning was the sempiternal, where solitary beings of neither form nor voice dwell. In the depth of their stasis, these beings shaped the cold darkness. Motionless and aimless, they just existed because they were thought, sight, and nothing at all. Eons went by, and sentience came to those supernal beings, and their endless reshaping taught them the origin of existence and the change that was time itself. Then, in an undetermined moment, the first worlds, namely those containing tangible things and the incarnation of existence, appeared. These shards of life were nothing compared to eternity, only shining stars in the dim sea of the night, inhabited by primitive creatures. The most well-made of these worlds was the material plane, and those supernal beings became part of it and were thereafter known as primes. Immanent to the world, they took physical form, where before was just time and thought, and learned to rule over matter as gods. This physical world is what came to be known as Yurman, which, in the first tongue, means living. Then we have the third truth. Life came as a consequence of existence in the earthly world, and with it came its cold and dark reflection, death. The first echoes of death came from a diaphanous mist and settled in a different plane, although connected to the material by a fault in cosmic balance. This plane was Enferun, where all that once was in Yurman becomes a shadow of itself. The first entities of this dimension were drawn of the primes, juvenile enough to inherit their craving for existence. These cravings led them to pull the two realities together, separated by veils that dissolve when sleep sends the living to a dark dream world through which they observe in a ravenous silence. Then we have information on the fourth truth. The oracle of the fourth truth announces an inevitable darkness on the earthly world. Eventually, night will be eternal, and the dark mirror will merge with Yurman. The echoes of death will seize the throne of the primes, transforming life into decay and madness. This age will last as long as death stands guard, because the void cannot exist without wholeness. Now we have information of Lagoran and Mirithlen. The birth of the old tradition has its roots in the First Age and is strictly related to the history of Thurinthian, proudest amongst the proud capitals of men. In ancient times, it was a crossroad famous to all peoples. Its culture was evolved, and its military was feared, thanks to the greatest virtue of the first men, the great council of the sages. Enlightened scholars and gifted spellcasters all, upstanding among the 7 sages, was the archmage Lagoran, once an extraordinary warlord and a steadfast politician. He mastered many crafts in his life, so much that he was called Archmeister by his subordinates and students, and led daring studies in cosmology and theology. His skill in magic was remarkable, and he observed the 3 sources from which it was drawn from, to the point of conjecturing the existence of the 3 worlds, one being the earthly world, and asserted that he experienced some kind of contact with the other 2. The discovery consumed him for many years. He confronted it with the lore of other peoples and devised new rituals, aiming to prove the existence of the unknown worlds. He appeared to be guided by an otherworldly being, as he single-handedly built the foundation of what eventually became the arcane studies to come, surpassing even the satyrs in their skill with enchantment. Alas, the further his research went, the more lunatic and deranged he became. Lagaran had a daughter, Mirithlen, whose name means Soul of Silver in the first tongue. She was a young apprentice in the Thurinthian temple, a place where the brightest minds and the most talented mages were chosen to be initiates of the sages, eventually taking their place when they reached old age. She was her father's initiate, and she witnessed his slow unraveling, watching helplessly as he began sinking into his research, his looks changing and his voice hiding in human tones. She eventually took Lagaran's seat in the council when he lost his mind and position, though keeping an eye on him. One night, Mirithlen of Thurinthian noticed that her beloved father was not in his quarters and began looking for him in the temple. The shadows of the night thickened as she was approaching the library where Lagaran's laboratory was. Inside, moonlight strived to filter from the windows, and unholy whispers tainted the silence. On the desk, there was a tome where the 3 truths had been transcribed, and a 4th had evidently been torn free. She looked around the room, and she spotted the corpse of one of the sages. It was horribly disfigured, soaked in blood, and surrounded by extinguished candles, its flesh carved with illegible symbols. As she touched the corpse, Mirithlen felt her body transcending its physical form, while darkness and searing frost engulfed her. When she regained her sight, she found herself in a place deprived of sound and smell, flayed by an icy wind. Eventually, she found her father, wandering around a majestic cathedral, solemn and decaying at the same time. His eyes were vitreous, and he held in his hand a scrap of paper written with his own blood. It was the 4th truth, omen of tragedy and of the end of all things. She lay weeping for a great many hours, holding the accursed paper in one hand and the heel of her father in the other, until finally she found the courage to stand up. She dragged him away from that sanctuary of death, whose sight could traumatize the hardest of men, and wandered, looking for a way out. Alas, Though they walked for hours and lost sight of the cathedral, they were as lost as ever, chased by unseen fiends who thirsted for them to stay in that realm. In a moment of desperation, she realized that the only way out was the way in. As the cold grew unbearable, so too did the desire not to let the Archmeister's efforts be in vain, and Mirithlen killed her own father. She carved the symbols she had seen on the corpse of that poor sage into his flesh, using nothing but her nails, and in doing so, she resurfaced to Yurman, filled with despair and regret, forever defiled by the act. The four truths were then revealed to the world. Along with Mirithlen's testimony, a new tenet took shape in the loss of the greatest scholar of all. Thus began the Second Age for the mortals of Yurman in the years after Lagoran. And this concludes this part of the review. Now, I didn't mention all of the details, but as you can see, Lagoran is such a tragic figure. He was a paragon, an exemplar. He was leading his people towards greater knowledge, but his obsession proved to be his downfall. And his daughter Mirithlen, she's such a controversial figure. She decided to sacrifice her own father in an unholy ritual to return and reveal the truth of those horrifically cosmic findings. In the next part, we are going to go through more historical details, specifically the moon goddess myth and the last sun. Thank you for watching this part of the review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending Drive-Thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.